In this video, we're going to continue our study of Pliny's Natural History. In Lesson 2 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Natural History course, you'll notice that we studied chapters 2 and 3 of Book 2 of Pliny's Natural History, chapters 2 and 3. Unfortunately, the chapters in Pliny's book are not equal in length. Some are very, very short, and so when we come upon a few chapters that are very short, we'll condense them into one lesson to try and make the lessons of similar length so that we can organize the course, and these videos will be similar in length and so on. So in Lesson 2, we'll study Book 2, chapters 2 and 3. What I'd like to do in this video is simply read through the content of chapters 2 and 3, provide a few comments as an introduction, and then allow students to get to work studying the lesson for mastery and completing the lesson assessments. So again, this is Lesson 2 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Natural History course, and it covers chapters 2 and 3 of Book 2 of Pliny's Natural History. So let's read together. This lesson, the subject or topic of this lesson is the form and nature of the world. The form and nature of the world. That the world has the form or shape of a perfect globe, perfect sphere or ball. That the world has the form of a perfect globe, we learn from the name which has been uniformly given to it, as well as from numerous natural arguments. So we say that the world is a perfect globe. The world is a sphere. And Pliny says that one argument we can make for that is the simple name that we give to it. But another set of arguments exists that have been made by philosophers through history. He says, not only does a figure of this kind return everywhere to itself or into itself and sustain itself, also including itself, requiring no adjustments, not sensible of either end or beginning in any of its parts, and is best fitted for that motion with which, as will appear hereafter, it is continually turning around. But still more, because we perceive it by the evidence of our sight to be in every part convex or rounded. We can see that it's rounded just by looking. If you go to the ocean and stand on the beach and look out over the horizon, we can see with our own eyes that the world is convex or rounded. We perceive it to be so by the evidence of our sight, to be in every part convex and central, which could not be the case if it were any other figure or shape. So there are reasons for us to believe and know that the world is a globe or a ball, and therefore when you hear people in modern schools or modern scientists say that in the past people thought the world was flat, and people thought that if Christopher Columbus sailed to the edge of the world, he might fall off the end of the world, that kind of talk about ancient people as if they were just ignorant, foolish people that didn't understand anything is proven to be a lie right here in Pliny's Natural History. No one thought the world was flat. No one thought the world was flat. This was written in the time that Jesus Christ lived. People didn't think the world was flat. They understood that the world was a globe. It was round. It was a sphere. Pliny argues you can tell this just by looking at it. There are all kinds of arguments to prove that the earth is a globe. So this is an example of where if we don't actually read ancient writings and we just let modern scientists or teachers or television shows tell us what ancient people thought and believed, we're going to find that a lot of that is just lies. It's not even true what they say about the ancient world. Pliny tells us plainly that even in ancient times, Everyone knew that the world was a globe. Everyone knew the world was round. There was never any reason to think otherwise. Okay? So, when you hear modern people who have never even studied ancient or classical literature talking about what people used to believe, you should pay attention and realize that they're probably just making stuff up because it's not true. People in the ancient world were very wise. They knew almost as much as we know today about any topic. And if we look into their writings, we'll find that the dopey ideas that people say existed in the ancient world are simply not true. All right? Pliny clearly understands in the first century of the Christian era, more than 2,000 years ago, he understands clearly that the world is round. Nobody thought Columbus was going to sail off the edge of the flat world and fall off into space. That's just made up nonsense. All right? Moving on. He says, the rising and the setting of the sun. The rising and setting of the sun. Here on the farm, over there, behind the gardens, the sun rises every morning in the east, and it goes across the sky, and back over there, it sets in the west every day, rises in the east in the same place, and sets in the west every single day. The rising and setting of the sun clearly prove that this globe is carried about in space of 24 hours in an eternal and never ceasing circuit. The rising and setting of the sun clearly prove that this globe, this ball, the earth, is carried around in the space of 24 hours in an eternal and never ceasing circuit. And again, when he uses the word eternal, he's not saying that the world is eternal in the same way that we as Christians would say that God, the Trinity, is eternal. When we say that God is eternal, we mean that he never had a beginning. He never had a beginning, and he will never have an end. That's what we mean when we talk about God as Christians, when we use the word eternal. Pliny's not necessarily saying that the world never had a beginning. What he's saying is that the time of the existence of the world is simply beyond human calculation, beyond human experience. It goes on and on, years after years, thousands of years after thousands of years, the sun rising and setting in the same way in the space of 24 hours, over and over, in an eternal and never ceasing circuit. Okay? There's order in the world, as we see in the rising and the setting of the sun. He also comments on the fact that the sun moves in its rising and setting and movement through the sky with quote-unquote incredible swiftness, at an amazing speed. He says, I am not able to say whether the sound caused by the whirling about of so great a mass be excessive, and therefore far beyond what our ears can perceive, nor indeed whether the resounding of so many stars, all carried along at the same time and revolving in their orbits, may not produce a kind of delightful harmony of incredible sweetness. To us, who are in the interior, on the inside of this world, the world appears to glide silently along, both by day and by night. You can watch this video again to go through that more slowly. You're going to be able to read it on your own, so I'm not worried about going too fast. But what Pliny's talking about here is that motion and sound are usually found together. So for example, the wind is blowing and that produces sound. If you throw a rock really fast and it whizzes by someone's ear, that rock going through the air makes a sound. So things in motion tend to make sounds. And what Pliny asks is, if the sun travels from the east all the way across the sky to the west every day in a matter of, let's say, 12 hours, it moves across the sky. To cover those thousands and thousands and thousands of miles in that amount of time, is incredibly fast, and therefore the sun, in moving, there must be some motion. There must be some sound produced by that motion. And then when we consider all of the other stars and planets and the moon, all moving in those great distances in very short amount of time, there must be some sound produced by all of these heavenly bodies. There must be some sound. And he refers to this harmony of the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon. There must be some sound, some music. And this is the idea of the music of the spheres, which Plato taught. The idea is that all of the heavenly bodies, all of the sun, moon, stars, planets, they all move around the earth in a circle or in an orbit. And these orbits are different sizes, just like the different lengths of strings on a harp. And because all of these planets are a certain size and they're moving at a certain speed, but they move at different lengths and so on, they must each produce a different sound. And because there are these different orbits and different planets, they must produce a range of different sounds. And it's likely, if God created the world, that God created these orbits to produce a sound that makes a harmony or a music. And this is called the music of the spheres, or heavenly music. All right? Now, when we sit out here, as I'm sitting under the sun in the world, the stars and the sun are all whirling about the earth. But I don't hear anything. I don't hear anything. And therefore I could conclude, based on my senses, that the sun doesn't in fact make any noise. But what Pliny acknowledges is that it may be that because that sound is being produced ever since the time we're born, that we may not even be able to tell that it exists, because we've never been in the world without that noise. And therefore maybe we just take it for granted. Okay, so just because we don't feel or sense that sound with our hearing doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's an interesting philosophical question, all right? A good example of this is the fact that as you watch this video, you're paying attention to me and listening to my voice and my words, and maybe in the first video or first few videos, you notice a lot of background noise. You notice that there are birds and that there's wind in the background and so on. But as you watch these videos more and more, you're going to pay less and less attention to the birds and the sound of the wind, and you're going to be able to concentrate more and more on just my voice, because the background noise is going to be taken for granted. All right? That's the idea that Pliny shares when he says that the music of the sun and the stars and the planets, we may just take it for granted because we've never been in the world and listened to the world without that noise, and therefore we wouldn't be able to tell if the heavenly bodies were making sounds or not. But anyway, this idea that the sun and moon and stars, because they move through such great spaces in such short amounts of time, should produce some kind of sound, and that because they're on different orbits and they're different sizes and they move at different speeds, those sounds would be different. And based on what we know about God and his desire for order in the universe, it would be assumed and probable that those sounds would be arranged to produce a harmony or a music of the heavens, which perhaps may be understood by us through contemplation and philosophy, but may not be audible to us through our senses. Okay, so that's what he's talking about there. Moving on. Various circumstances in nature prove to us that there are impressed on the heavens innumerable figures of animals and all kinds of objects, and that its surface is not perfectly polished like the eggs of birds, as some celebrated authors assert. For we find that the seeds of all bodies fall down from it, principally into the ocean, and being mixed together, that a variety of monstrous forms are in this way frequently produced. And indeed, this is evident to the eye. For in one part we have the figure of a wain, in another of a bear, of a bull, and of a letter, while in the middle of them, over our heads, there is a white circle. With respect to the name, I am influenced by the unanimous opinion of all nations. For what the Greeks, from its being ornamented or decorated, the Greeks have termed cosmos. That's how they refer to the heavens, the cosmos. We, Romans, from its perfect and complete elegance have termed mundus. The name Caelum no doubt refers to its being engraven, as it were, with the stars, as Varro suggests. In confirmation of this idea, we may adduce the Zodiac, in which there are 12 figures of animals, and through them it is that the sun has continued its course for so many ages. Now, there's a lot in that reading that's probably new to you, that is worth learning about. And I'll say a little bit about it now. We're about 16 minutes into this video, so I'll take a few minutes to talk about what Pliny is referring to here. And let me make a recommendation. If your parents have a smartphone, either an iPhone or an Android phone, I'd like you to ask them on my behalf to find an app that's called Google Sky, and download that app on your phone. And then what I'd like you to do is, at nighttime, or you can do it anytime because the stars are always out, we just don't see them when the sun has risen. What I'd like you to do is, on that app on your phone, I'd like you to hold it up to the sky, and I'd like you to move it around until you find the Zodiac, which is a band that wraps around the world on an angle. And all of the major constellations, there's 12 of them, they form a band of constellations that wrap around the earth. And you'll find that the sun moves in that band through all of those different constellations. And as the year goes around, the sun moves faster than those constellations. And so it moves through them day by day. It gets further and further ahead of each constellation. And every month it moves into a new constellation, through that constellation, and then away from that constellation and into the next constellation. And it does this month by month. So if all you had was that Google app on your phone, or if you got to learn the constellations in the sky, which is the goal, obviously, but the app is very helpful to get started. You could look at the sky at night and see what constellations were in different places and where the sun was in those constellations, and that would tell you what time of the year it is, based on the constellations of the Zodiac, the 12 constellations. And that's what Pliny is referring to here. He says that we adduce the name Zodiac, in which there are 12 figures of animals, and through them it is that the sun has continued its course for so many ages. So, looking at the world, he says that there are a number of arguments that can be made to prove that the world is a globe. One is the fact that the heavenly objects move around it in the same pattern, rising in the same place, setting in the same place, again and again every 24 hours. And the only way that would be possible, based on how it can be observed, is if the earth itself is a globe. He says if we look at the horizon, our eyes tell us that there is a convex surface of the earth, or a rounded surface of it's not flat, it's not shaped like a bowl, which is concave. It's convex, it's rounded like a ball. We can see that. All right? So he makes a few arguments to offer as simple proofs to suggest that the world is a globe, and he introduces us to the paths or circuits or orbits of the sun, moon, and stars, and particularly the 12 constellations that make up the Zodiac. All right, so that's chapters 2 and 3 in Pliny's Natural History. He talks about the figure of the world, that it's a globe, and he offers a few proofs to help us be certain that it's so. It's time for you to study this lesson for mastery on your own. I strongly, strongly encourage you to learn more about the Zodiac, whether you look up information on the internet or whether you go to the library and find books on the Zodiac. Learn about the constellations in the Zodiac. Learn how they reveal the months of the year to us, how they relate to the sun and its orbit around the earth, and so on. Before I finish, I should just comment on one thing. You may be wondering, why are we talking about the sun and the moon and the stars going around the earth? I thought it was proven that the earth actually goes around the sun. That's a complicated subject, all right, because it was in the 1500s, Galileo and Copernicus proposed the idea that scientists should not think of the sun moving around the earth, but instead that they should think of the earth moving around the sun. And the reason why they said that was because if we make the sun the center and measure everything from the sun, it makes it much easier for scientists to make certain calculations. And therefore they argued it's a better model. It's a better model. Now, what they were not saying is that it is necessary and true that the earth moves around the sun, and that anyone who says that the sun moves around the earth is false. What Einstein explained in the theory of relativity and in his writing on physics is that it's perfectly fine for us to choose the earth as our reference point, and by our senses to note that there are objects that are in motion relative to the earth. If we take the earth as our non-moving point that we measure all movement from, that's perfectly fine. It's relative motion. The motion is relative to the earth. And that's how we speak of the sun rising and setting, the zodiac, and so on. We speak of all these things relative to the earth. But for the sake of scientific exploration or calculations and so on, the scientists argued that it's better if we use the sun as our point of reference and described all motion relative to the sun. It's a different frame of reference, okay? A different coordinate system. I think that's what Einstein called it, a different coordinate system. So it's not true or false. We can say both. We can say the earth is the center of the universe and everything moves around the earth, and we mean that relatively. Or we can say that the sun is taken as the center point and all motion is judged and measured relative to the sun. Both of them are perfectly fine. We don't need to choose one. One is not true and the other false. It's simply two different frames of reference, two different worldviews, two different coordinate systems, and they're both okay. So when Pliny talks about the motion of the sun and the planets, he's simply talking in relation to the earth. He assumes the earth to be at rest and speaks of the motion of all of the heavenly bodies by his own observation relative to the earth. That's not false. He simply makes the earth his point of reference. Copernicus and Galileo simply made the sun their point of reference. All right? We don't need to pick one or the other. We can choose to look at each when we need to, when it's helpful. If I'm reading poetry or thinking of the world from my back porch, it's perfectly fine for me to look at the sun and say, the sun rises, the sun moves through the sky and sets, and understand that I'm just using myself and my porch as a frame of reference. But if I go into a science or a physics classroom, it's important for me to understand that they're taking the sun to be the reference point and speaking of motion in relation to the sun. That's perfectly fine. So don't be upset or confused if you see Pliny referring to things, or even me referring to things in relation to the Earth. We can do either. We can choose any point in the universe. We can choose Mars or the moon and describe all motion from any reference point. All right? One is not true and the other false. So I hope that clears that up. Anyway, that's 25 minutes. I'd like to wrap up this video. So we've walked through a first reading of Lesson 2 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Natural History course. Now I'd like you to study this lesson for mastery, complete the lesson assessment, proving your mastery of the lesson, and we'll keep moving through Pliny's Natural History. God bless your studies.